All right, in this section, we're going to talk a little bit more about the expenditure approach. Okay, so we're going to talking about the expenditure approach, which basically is looking at total spending. So we're going to measure the total spending in the economy. So we're looking here, total spending. And this spending can be divided up in a certain way. I'm going to use Y for this total spending. It's also going to be our total production in our economy. So it can be divided up as consumption plus investment plus government spending plus our exports minus our imports. And so the key thing about this is when we do this expenditure approach, it really matters on who's doing the spending. So that's how we've categorized it here. For the most part, at least it does. So first we have our consumption, and then our consumption is, well, what is it, right? So what? Well, it's goods and services. So all the different goods and services consumers are buying are put here. And then the real question that determines the category is who. Okay, so the who is doing the buying is households. And then our second one is mostly a consistent category. So investment could be goods, but it also could be structures. So when I say goods, I'm saying things like cars and machines, and also inventory. And here when we say who, well, it's mostly firms, but in the case of except for new houses. So there's one kind of structure, new houses, which generally the final buyer of them is, at least of most of them, is households, but they are counted here in investment. And so that's kind of an unusual thing that kind of throws off the overall logic, but it still keeps fairly consistent. So that's the one thing that households buy that's considered investment. Otherwise, what they buy should go under consumption. So yeah, like if somebody buys a car, if it's a household buys a car for their personal use, that's consumption. If a firm buys a car, that's investment. Okay, so then we go government spending. So the government spending could be goods, services, also could be structures, like building new buildings or something. And the key part is, well, who does it? Well, it's the government. So any spending the government's doing, it counts here. Now, something want to mention here, notice in here doesn't include any kind of transferring money to people. So all of the government programs that involve transferring money to people, like Social Security, for the pension for older people, none of those, that doesn't count, because there's no good or service being provided. There's nothing being exchanged or payment. Now, government spending on healthcare would count. It counts as a service, or government spending on education counts. It counts here. But government transfers, where there's no transaction that takes place, it's just money being transferred from one side to the other. Those are not production, so they're not counted here. The other thing I should say about government spending, this includes both the local level. It also includes the state or province level, and then it includes the federal level, the whole national level government. All of them are included. And then finally, we have exports. Well, this could be, again, goods and services. But the who is the part, so it's produced here, it's produced in a certain country, and the who is, well, we'll call it foreign entities. So that could include governments, households, and firms, right? Some kind of foreign entity. And then finally, we subtract our imports. So the subtracting of the imports is, well, these are already included somewhere else. So for example, these imports could be included here in consumption, or import, or investment, or government spending. And we're trying to eliminate them, right? So they were counted there because they were consumption, or they're counted there because, yes, your firm did buy equipment. But then if they were imported from another country and not made in the country we're talking about, then we need to take them away there. So this just eliminates goods made in other places. Okay, produced abroad. Okay. One other thing I should probably say before I move on, this investment, going up here back to investment, doesn't include any kind of financial investment. So again, if we're talking about production, well, financial investment is not production. Therefore, it's not counted here. So we're talking about real things, actual goods or structures is what we're talking about when we talk about this kind of investment in economics. Now, just briefly, we can take a look at the categories in terms of percentages. Just as a warning, I wanted to point this out because this was from your textbook. The way the chart was drawn looks very misleading. So actually, we can see consumption is almost 70% of the total. So this is the biggest category. But in this chart, it looks like it's about 50%. That's because the investment category is negative. The import category is negative. So it kind of throws off the whole table when you throw that in. But anyways, we get the idea. The consumption is by far the biggest. We'll talk in a second why the investment category is also very important, even though it's not that large compared to the overall economy. So let's go and look at some long-run trends and see something. So first of all, we can see two things about consumption. Well, it has grown over time, right? That's one thing we can say. And we can see it went from about 60% to almost 70%, and it's also relatively stable. Now, what do I mean by relatively stable? Some of you might be saying, well, it seems to be growing over time. What I mean by stable is not bouncing up and down a lot. So it is taking small movements. Back in the 80s, the movements, or late 70s, early 80s, the movements would have been sharper. So it's taking small movements, but when you compare it to the overall height of the line, these movements are really small, right? Relative to the total height of the line, some of it's moving like 1% up or percentage point up or down, and we compare that to 70% total. It's not really moving very much. It's quite stable. One of the reasons why is we'll kind of find out some of them later, but people don't tend to cut their lifestyle very much in a recession. Even in a recession, most people keep their jobs, and lots of people keep their jobs, and their income is similar to what it was before. And so for the most part, people don't make humongous changes. Also, we have some programs which like unemployment insurance, which help to make incomes a little more stable as well. And so people don't tend to make large cuts to their consumption when recessions hit. They do make, it still is an important category. It can move around a little bit, but not so huge. In terms of the stability, it's not quite as big a factor as some of the unstable categories. Now, speaking of unstable categories, let's go to I. So I is somewhere around like 17, 18, 19%, but it's very unstable. So let's take a look. If we look at investment during the financial crisis, here we go. Okay, so it's take a huge dip going from, I don't know, just eyeballing it, looks like it's going from about 18% to about 13, 14%. So there's a huge drop. Meanwhile, we compare the same time period, we compare consumption, just a little dupe, not too much is going on. So one thing we can say about it is quite unstable. And the reason why it's unstable is because the nature of what it is. In terms of firms buying new equipment, this could always be delayed, and often is. If the economic outlook is not very strong for a period of time, the firms can delay buying new equipment. Also, it includes new structures, including new houses, and so often the real estate market cools down quite a lot if there's a large recession, and the building will cool down quite a lot because the building companies will expect there won't be too much demand during this time. So again, this accounts for this being really unstable. We can see, just looking at some different time points, this being very unstable and bouncing around a lot. So we'll come back and look a little bit more about that when we talk about business cycle. Now, when we talk about the government, some of you might be a little surprised. I think a lot of you thought maybe not a lot of you, some of you probably might have thought the government number would be actually going up over time, and it appears to be relatively flat, although maybe going down a little bit over time. Now, part of the reason is this government, again, this is G, is only, remember, goods and services. So government spends a lot of other money. One of the big ones going forward is going to be Social Security. So it spends a lot of other money that isn't counted here. So transfer payments not counted here, but this does include not only spending on education and health and national parks and all kinds of government workers and local parks and rec and all that kind of stuff. It also includes spending on the military. So this is quite substantial, and we do see some movements. Now, we're going to save this for later, but we'll find that actually often government spending responds to recession. So it's not necessarily caused. The growths or dips are not necessarily caused by recessions, but it's actually often a response to what the economy is doing. And we'll talk about this later when we talk about fiscal policy. Finally, let's look at exports and imports. So the first thing to notice that kind of jumps right out at you is right around the late 1970s until the current time period, we have a persistent trade deficit. Okay, so that kind of should jump right out at you. So there has been a trade deficit for a very long time, and this has both some positives and some negatives. It's not a clear 100% negative. It's also definitely not a clear positive. So hopefully in the 7th week of class, we'll come back and talk about a little bit about trade and trade deficits and international things, and we can get a little deeper into this. For now, just know that because the imports minus the exports minus the imports is negative, so that means our overall GDP will be less than the sum of consumption, investment, and government spending. So for now, let's just leave it at that, and then hopefully we can come back in week 7 and go a little bit deeper into this. All right. In the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to move on to talk about looking at this from production point of view, and we're going to want to see, well, here's our total spending, and we're going to try to talk about the idea, well, this should also be equal to our total production. So if we count from the production side, here we're counting how much was spent on all these things that were made, and if we just count the things that were produced, regardless of who is spending the money, we should come up to the same number. So let's wait for the next video to do that one.